August 27, 2025. It was supposed to be a day of new beginnings, but it turned into an unimaginable end. A back-to-school mass inside a Minneapolis church was shattered by an act of horrific violence. Today, we're going to try to understand what happened, who was responsible, and, maybe most importantly, grapple with the deeply unsettling questions this tragedy leaves behind.
So let me paint a picture for you. It's the Annunciation Catholic Church in Minneapolis. You've got nearly 200 people inside, kids, parents, parishioners. They're all there for a back-to-school mass. You know the sound, hymn books rustling, the quiet murmur of prayers, maybe some soft laughter from the kids. It's a sanctuary, truly just filled with that sense of hope and community before a new school year.
And then, in an instant, all of that peace was just gone, desecrated. Archbishop had to ask the question that was on everyone's mind. How can this happen in God's house? It's a question that just hangs in the air, echoing through a community that was suddenly consumed by shock and by grief.
Well, this is the story of how it did. We're going to walk through the anatomy of this tragedy, from the moments of the attack itself to the complicated portrait of the shooter and the fractured, polarized response that came after, all to try and understand how a place of peace became a place of violence.
So let's start with the attack itself. That awful moment when a house of worship became a scene of pure terror.
Now, the shooter didn't even go inside the church. No, instead they barricaded the doors from the outside, trapping everyone. And then from the parking lot, they just opened fire with a rifle. Bullets tore through those beautiful, historic stained glass windows, and the whole sanctuary was just sprayed with glass. In less than 2 minutes, a prayer service became a desperate fight for survival.
The cost was just devastating. 2 children, only 8 and 10 years old, were killed right there as they sat in the pews praying.
And 17 other people, more kids and adults too, were wounded by the gunfire and all that flying debris. Their sanctuary, their safe space, was turned into a war zone.
What we know from inside is a story of absolute chaos, but also incredible bravery. One 10-year-old boy remembered being shielded by his friend, who then got hit. The school principal talked about how adults, and even the older kids, just instinctively threw themselves over the younger ones to protect them. Right in the middle of all that terror, you had these incredible acts of heroism.
So, the question is, who could do something like this? The attacker's name was Robin Westman, and, well, her story is just a web of haunting contradictions.
See, the shooter wasn't a stranger at all. Robin Westman, 23 years old, was a former student at that very school. Her own mother had been the church secretary there for 5 years. That deep personal connection just makes the whole thing even more baffling. And there's another layer here. Court records show that back in 2020, at age 17, Westman legally changed her name, stating in the filing that she identifies as a female. To even begin to understand the motive, you have to look at what Westman left behind. It's like a manifesto of contradictions, pieced together from digital and physical clues that paint this deeply, deeply disturbing picture. On one hand, you have these letters, which were scheduled to be sent right after the attack. In them, Westman writes about this profound personal despair, feeling corrupted by this world, a long, long battle with severe depression. She even talks about a fear of dying from cancer, writing, "I want to go out on my own means." It really shows a mind that was just consumed by hopelessness.
But then, you look at the weapons, and that personal pain is paired with this shocking display of ideological hate. The guns, which were purchased legally, were literally covered in violent, hateful messages. It was this chaotic mess of anti-Semitic slurs, anti-Christian slogans, threats against the president, and praise for other infamous mass shooters. This wasn't just despair. It felt like a performance of violent extremism. And there is no doubt this was planned. Westman's journals, partially written in a code based on the Cyrillic alphabet, along with YouTube videos, had coded plans and even a hand-drawn diagram of the church layout. With all this evidence, it didn't take long for the FBI to officially designate the attack as an act of anti-Catholic domestic terrorism and a hate crime.
So, this brings us to the central, tangled question of this whole tragedy. What was the real motive here? Was this driven by mental illness and that deep personal despair? Or was it a calculated act of extremist ideology? Or somehow, was it both at the same time?
Well, there's a framework that actually helps make some sense of this.
A report funded by the Department of Justice defines lone wolf terrorism as violence by people acting alone, who often mix personal grievances with political ones. And man, that description seems to fit this case almost perfectly.
That same report lays out this common, tragic pathway. It starts with a grievance, both personal and political. Then the person finds validation online with hate groups. They get inspired by other extremists, an enabler. They broadcast what they're going to do, and then some final trigger sets it all off. From the despair in the letters to the hate on the guns, from idolizing past shooters to posting plans, Westman followed this tragic blueprint step by step. Of course, a tragedy like this doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It sends shockwaves through society. And the political fallout was, well, immediate and incredibly divisive.
Almost instantly, this horrible event was pulled into three very different, competing arguments. You had some, like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who zeroed in on Westman's gender identity as the cause. Then you had others arguing that the real focus should be on mental health, that extremist ideas latch on to people who are vulnerable and disconnected. And then a really forceful call for gun control came from Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, who pointed out the painful, awful irony of offering thoughts and prayers when these victims were killed while they were literally praying.
And while these fierce debates were raging, the official responses were all calling for unity. Minnesota's Governor Walz said that children were met with evil and horror. President Trump ordered flags to be flown at half-staff. And all the way from the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope, sent a telegram with his condolences. But these calls for everyone to come together just stood in such stark contrast to the deep divisions that were playing out everywhere else.
So, after digging into the facts, the motives, and the fallout, we aren't really left with any clean answers. What we are left with is this profound, lingering, and deeply uncomfortable feeling. Because you see, Westman's story isn't just about one person's collapse into violence. It's about what happens in our world when someone's profound, private despair gets twisted together with the hateful ideologies that are so easy to find online. It forces all of us to ask a question that has no easy answer. How do we stop the next one? How do we see and help the next isolated, broken, and armed person before their private pain becomes a public tragedy? That's the question that, for now, is left hanging in the air, like an unanswered prayer.